All right, welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you all for joining today. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat and let me know. My name's Ash. I work with Infotech. I'll be happy to help you out. And during the course of the webinar, you'll have questions for our speakers, so please send them in using the question pane. We will have a Q&A session with our speakers at the end. And rest assured, everyone will receive a copy of the slides and a link to the webinar, along with our BYOD calculator within a couple of days. So without further ado, let's get started. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Tracy Fleming, Office of the CTO and BYOD Evangelist at Avaya, and James McCloskey, Lead Analyst at Infotech. And over to you, James.
Good morning, everybody. As Ash said, it's James McCloskey. I'm one of our senior research analysts at Infotech. I cover the voice, video, and unified communication, or generally real-time IP communications topics. I also have a background with security, and so these issues associated with bring your own device and consumerization are very near and dear to my heart, both on the communication and collaboration side and on the issues of support and security that go along with them. I look forward to speaking with you this morning.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Tracy Fleming. I'm a member of the Office of the CTO for Avaya globally, and spend a lot of my time thinking about BYOD and the trends that's happening in the market. And I've been with Avaya for a little over 12 years now, and it's been quite a ride based here in Canada, and looking forward to our conversation today. All right, so as mentioned, my role in Avaya is I lead I'm part of the Office of the CTO, primarily focused around SIP and the emergence and the transformation that's going on in the market, and certainly led by the BYOD space. Now, 2012 is an interesting year all around on many fronts. You know, just some interesting statistics. BYOD or 2012, sorry. There are 3 Friday the 13th in 2012. There are 5 weekends in June this year. And interestingly, during the winter solstice this year, the Mayan long count calendar ends, shifting us from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius. And the challenges that are going on socially in the market. What does this have to do with BYOD? Well, I think it's an interesting discussion as to the challenges that we see this year. But anyway, don't worry, because the world is not coming to an end. But that happened in 1999. And I had an interesting sort of role in 1999. I was director of ISIT at one of the Bell Canada companies. And 1999 was a different world from where we are today. I remember sitting there at the end of the year waiting for the change and some of the challenges that we saw with Y2K. And the type of IT infrastructure that we were driving back then was fundamentally different than what we're seeing today. We see this growth and this emergence of not only social media, but the style and type of devices that are being deployed today are just fundamentally different from what we saw many years ago. And that leads me into, when we get into this concept of overall transformation, we got to look at what are the underlying trends that are driving this. And we think it's a couple. Primarily, one of the ones that's doing this is this concept of democratization of IT. If you look on the left-hand side of this chart, in 1999, when I was in ISIT myself, we really ran a model that was about providing a lot of services to the top rank and file. And I had complete autonomy over who I gave stuff to, who I enabled, so everybody got the exact same mobile device, everybody got the exact same phone. And if you didn't buy into that model, if I could choose who I wanted to deploy that technology to. If I didn't want to deploy that technology, then you just simply didn't get it. And it was very much a haves and a haves not kind of framework. What the challenges we're trying to drive today is, how do we drive that same level of capability that's being deployed typically at the executive ranks down to the entire organization within the company. So the challenge here is we got to drive these services and capabilities not only from the executive ranks, but into the entire depth and breadth of our organizations. Why do we have to do this? Well, The other trend that's happening on our industry is the consumerization of IT. The technologies that are available to us today are fundamentally different than the technologies we had a decade ago. We could get away with deploying it to a very small select group of individuals because there was no other options a decade ago. Today, you can literally walk out to the local computer store and buy mobile portable devices that have phenomenal amounts of computing power, access to information, geolocations, presence information, social media, video conferencing, things like LinkedIn and social networks, video networks, and the power that's in the palm of your hand that you can literally just pick up at the corner store. And that technology is inherently going to be people are going to want to bring that into the corporation. And that's not a model that we can just sit back as IT leaders anymore and say, stop, you're not going to do this, because those models are happening and it's being led as sort of a ground-up initiative. The other way that we think about this, so if you think about this holistically, BYOD is really the coming together of these two macro environmental trends. And it's a lot broader than just wanting to bring your own device, and we'll expand on that in a little bit here. There's a couple other trends that are leading into this, that tie into this. The early discussion here was that it was about expenditure conversion. Some people thought that BYOD was literally just a model that let's take the money that we're spending on devices and let's transfer that into employees. That's a short-term view of that, and it's not a biased long-term view that that's the total value proposition here. There's a lot broader discussions to have than an expenditure-only conversion, although there still could be some short-term benefits to be had there. Another major area of expectation is this concept of service delivery transformation. We go through this, I see this constantly with Avaya, and I see it in other companies, where end users are getting to the model now. They're saying, instead of my expectation, in 1999, my expectation was I joined the company and I expected IT to provide me with a computer, with a mobile device, and I expected sort of that full suite of complementary services. I wanted IT to do everything top to bottom. I wanted full desktop support, full mobile support. I expected them to do everything. And today, we're really getting to a model that says, I'm not really expecting that. I want to be able to bring a device to the office and just tell me where the service interfaces are. Tell me how to get on the wireless LAN. Tell me where to plug in to get voicemail or to get email. Tell me what those services are, and I'll start to consume those services, and I will do my own sort of support model to the extent that I think I need to on these devices. And where I need help, I may reach out to a social community either externally or internally, sort of that self-help type of discussion, and that frees up some of the traditional desktop support models and allows individuals to go back, the IT organization to go back and focus on the creation of new services and the creation of new delivery mechanisms as opposed to just a pure desktop support model. Now, it's not a one-size-fits-all model, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But then finally, we also need to start to think about what the other area that's driving into this is certainly just the concept of device affinity. More so than ever, we love our devices. There are people in this business, there's companies in this business that literally weren't in this business a couple years ago. There's tablets on the market today that not only are people buying these tablets for $300 to $700, a tablet or a smartphone for $300 to $700, but they're buying new ones every year. They're refreshing these technologies at a rate that we had never seen before in our industry. A decade ago, you bought a phone and you kept it for that long. Today, not only are we buying these devices and love them, but we're refreshing them on a pretty consistent basis.
So from an infotech perspective, I'd also note that we're in very much agreement with what Tracy is saying here in terms of the drivers and the trends that are surrounding the BYOD. But I think it's important to note from our research that that when you look at BYO programs as a means to reduce your absolute cost of devices and support in the near term, that's not a terribly likely outcome. The reality is that a do-nothing model for BYO, just letting new BYO devices into your environment without doing more in terms of support and security, is going to cost you more in those incidents being more frequent, in being less able to deal with incident response, dealing with compliance and audit costs, and just dealing with ad hoc support costs. On the other hand, if you look at BYO in terms of this service transformation that Tracy spoke about, you can really take a more holistic view and look at how you can reduce the cost for both your mobile and your traditional workers. Our research, again, has shown that when you take that approach, that holistic approach with a focus on both device and network security and a focus on both application and desktop abstraction through web applications, through app or desktop virtualization, you can save up to 20% or more even over the cost of doing nothing with BYO. And really the big benefit in terms of the service transformation is enabling deeper savings for your internal business by reducing or eliminating, in some cases, the costs of doing endpoint refreshes. So if you can get off that standard 3 to 5 year desktop laptop refresh cycle and instead get into thin clients or true BYO programs, there's some real benefits in terms of saving on support and even saving on security when it's done well.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're seeing that transformation happen on a pretty significant scale now. It's moving over to the next slide. Some of the other drivers that we're seeing here is obviously this is going to be dependent on the demographics of the end user base, right? Depending on where you are on the scale, sort of dictates how fast you may want to adopt this technology. I tell a story where my stepdaughter, when she was 5 years old, walked into a mall with us. We went into a mall and she saw one of these big mall display boards that happened to be shaped like an iPhone, and it had some video on it at the bottom, and she walked up and she just swiped the display board with her hand, and she just expected the display board to interact with her because that's how she interacts with other devices. And she looked at me and she said, you know, this thing's broken. And I said, it's not broken, it just doesn't work that way. So there's this concept that new things are just going to work in a way that you expect. And if you look at sort of the other end of the spectrum, again, there's a different way of people interacting with those types of devices. So these expectations are going to go hand in hand with this next model. Personal investment. Employees are increasingly more likely today to want to invest some of their own personal money in their own personal productivity, whether it being a laptop, a smartphone, or a tablet of their own personal use, and then again, with the expectation of being able to use that somehow within the corporation. Another major trend that we're seeing is the concept of if all things being equal, in students coming out of large universities are taking these things into consideration. The ability to use social networks, the ability for them to pick their style of device, whether they want to be an Android user, they want to bring their own Mac, they want to bring an iPhone or a BlackBerry or some other corporate tool that they want to bring in from their world into the office. So all things being equal, these factors are now starting to play into considerations of where university students are taking and accepting jobs. So that's another model we have to start to look at. Another driver, of course, is just the absolute existence of mobile networks, so Wi-Fi, long-term evolution. All those elements are driving adoption of mobile devices to the extent that we haven't seen in a couple of years. So that's another emerging area of technology for sure. I mentioned earlier around where you are in that sort of technology spectrum. Individualization is a very significant component of BYOD. In 1999, the model was very much around, here's the tools, you use them, and we're done. Individualization says that we're not going to have a one-size-fits-all model. So we're going to have to change some of the back-end systems. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But being able to pick and choose user communities and have user profiles will be a fundamental requirement in this next generation way we look at this for sure. And then finally, this concept of emergence of business and personal devices. In many places, I'm still seeing people walking around carrying maybe the corporately provided device as well as the device that they use for their own personal capabilities. The trend is certainly going to drive to having those two devices merge towards a single device that is they're both their personal and their corporate device of choice. we think that's going to be a pretty big trend, and get away from this concept of call me on that number, call me on this number. So I think that's going to be a big trend. James?
Yeah, I think it's particularly useful to look at the generations that's referred to as millennials in terms of a very much a lens to look at all of these aspects of the user centricity through. More than any other generation previously, millennials have defined themselves by their use of technology, and that's evident in how they're attached to personal devices and various specific applications, social media in particular, but sometimes productivity tools that they've just decided really speak to them and work the way that they want to work, as well as in the willingness to invest their own money on these devices and applications, and as Tracy referenced earlier, switching on a regular basis as well. So in terms of their attitudes, the research really shows that millennials have higher expectations for some work-life balance. And to me, that's a really good thing. And technology flexibility can absolutely support that work-life balance. But at the same time, this group of millennials also admit to suboptimal security practices. And I'll talk a bit more about that on some future slides. The other consideration when you talk about this group of millennials, and it's now expanding out to other groups who are in different generations, older and more entrenched in the business, we're seeing much more of an exhibition of a blended public persona. So as opposed to the history of more people have traditionally delineated their personal and the professional personas unless they were in a very public role. Now we're seeing much more of that blending between them, and again, that has some impact in terms of the potential security risks and privacy risks. So the last thing I'd say on this is, while I've spoken a bit on millennials in particular, but this isn't just about your employee base. As Tracy said, this is also evolving expectations among consumers of all ages about how they're going to access your services, multiple channels into your customer service offerings, and how they're going to access that from an increasing range of devices, not just the telephone or the traditional PC, but getting customer service, for example, on a mobile platform. So I think there's a tremendous amount of change in front of us in terms of how our own users and how our customers are consuming our services.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think there's the challenges we're facing in this space are many, and to give you a sense of some of those challenges, when we start to get into the realities here, we look at it from a few different lenses. One, probably first and foremost, is information security. If you look at the IT guys out there, I mean, I know when I was doing this a decade ago, my number one reason for having that control model in place was safeguarding corporate assets, safeguarding corporate information, and we needed to have that model in place. Not the least of that is when we start letting third-party devices come into the network and people potentially bringing their own devices into the network, we have to figure out that is a shared device now. If the only pictures in existence of your daughter's birthday are on the same device as corporate customer information, and you're going to let that device onto the network, there has to be a vetting of the information. Do we let the device on based on service packs and so on? But as a company, we want to be able to go out and say that device has violated some sort of corporate security process, or it's been lost. We now need to be the ability to go and wipe it. Do we wipe the entire device and therefore wiping out the personal information? Is there agreement between the people that own those personal devices that that's okay? Can you segment the data? Can you wipe out just corporate data and not wipe out personal data? Those are all factors that we have to take into consideration. The concept of multiple contact numbers has been with us for years in our industry, and everybody goes through this on a day-to-day basis. Somebody says, call me, and they say, and the first thing is, well, where? What number would you like me to call you at? Should I call you at your work, or I call you at your cell, or call you at your home? And what I would argue is nobody ever calls Tracy Fleming. They would call a device that they thought that I would be in close proximity to. And in true next-generation models, it's not going to be about that. It's you want to call Tracy, and then the system should be able to figure out where Tracy is, what device he's carrying, what services and capability that he wants, and we abstract all that underlying complexity away. One of the things we know for sure in this space is that complexity kills, that we got to make things simple and easy for people to use and hide some of that back-end complexity. Another area of concern is how do we get access to this? Everything is fine if we're all in the same building. None of these problems exist. But today, the very nature of BYOD and mobility suggests that I'm going to be traveling. You know, today, I live just outside of Waterloo, and today I'm sitting in our office in Belleville. So I'm traveling. How do I get access to capabilities, and what devices are going to access? Can I access it from the local coffee shop? Where do I need to be? And then the third, the last part of this is a major challenge in our networks today, and we'll refer to this a little bit more later, but just device proliferation. This concept of moving into multiple devices. Again, I knew a long time ago that when I showed up at work, I would typically have a laptop, and I would have a cell phone, but that cell phone didn't have an IP address, and there was no such thing as a tablet. Today, I'm carrying a laptop, probably a smartphone that will consume not only Wi-Fi services, but an IP address, and a tablet that when it goes online, it'll consume an IP address and Wi-Fi. So every single user that hits the network today is carrying 3 devices, and we're having this multiplier effect on both the network and infrastructure as well as the bandwidth and the resources. So those are some of the drivers, some of the challenges that we're going to have to overcome to really get serious about BYOD.
And very much our research again supports all of these points, and most importantly, I think, is that what we're seeing in the industry, what we're seeing in our conversations with clients, is that you can't stem the tide of these devices, except in very rare cases with organizations that have an extremely high security profile. For the vast majority of organizations, you can't beat them, so you need to deal with them in a secure way. And a very specific example of this is that 60% of millennials admitted to using whatever application, device, or technology they felt was appropriate, regardless of where it came from or regardless of whether it was in correspondence with the corporate IT policies. And that compared 69% versus 31% of others. So that doesn't mean that the problem is only millennials, but it is a particular challenge with the millennial group. Blocking the personal device access to the systems and the data isn't really an adequate response. There are ways to work around this, whether it's emailing the material out to a personal account or linking it up through something like Evernote so that it's available on the personal devices. And those have obviously some security and business continuity implications for you. So in the end, our feeling at Infotech is the answer has to be enabling the desired secure behavior and reducing the need for insecure workarounds to allow your corporate policy to be enforceable and defensible. And coming with that, of course, is you've got to be able to take appropriate steps to protect the data in the inevitable event that some devices will be lost or stolen. This is an increasing problem given the proliferation of these devices with massive storage. As Tracy said, there are some considerations you have to have about the shared devices, but taking a focus on how you can deliver these services securely with a minimal data footprint on the devices is a really important step towards being able to enable mass adoption of BYOD without putting your organization at risk.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're certainly seeing that those discussions, and it's quite fascinating to have these discussions when I'm talking with customers. I've talked with a lot of customers. And I talked to some senior executives, and they say, well, no, people don't bring those devices in because we told them they're not allowed to. And all you have to do is walk the floor of their companies, and you'll walk up to somebody, and there they are in their cubicle with their corporately provided computer, and right next to them there's an iPad or a device of some kind that's that's talking to the network. And to your point, they're sending emails from one device to another device. So people are going to find ways around this. So what we believe at Avaya is in order to solve some of the underlying root causes of these problems, actually go back to some of the base infrastructure that we have in place today. So the solution here isn't sort of a military command and control style of thou shalt not do this. It's to look at the architectures that we have in place, understand where these have come from over the years, and if you take a look at the slide here, and we sort of started this whole industry in this standalone PBX world, which was a terminal connected to a box in the closet that provided telephony-type services. and all the features and functionality were in that box. And it was, in some cases, pretty hard to upgrade, or it took a long time in capital money to upgrade that box. Over time, we took those boxes and we networked them together. So if I had 10 offices, I would have 10 phone systems. And then part of the industry looked at this concept of a soft switch, right? Let's move to an IP-based model, but let's try to get a lot of scale, but by giving a lot of scale, we reduce the overall feature density and capabilities. And again, I compound my problem around how do I upgrade it and how do I add new services. And if I can't add new services as fast as the users are requesting it, the users will find ways around these models, right? Some vendors have chosen the hierarchy approach, where let's just build upon systems. Build a box, when we outgrow that box, slap on another box, and then try to control it in a different fashion. Again, same sort of architectural limitations. And then finally, you look at this concept of a distributed model. Same challenges, only this one here ultimately collapsed under its own weight in terms of the complexity of this model, because there's no sort of central control plane. The belief at Avaya is that the next generation model has to come from this concept of what we believe is a communications core. And a communications core is not about telephony or about video or about collaboration. It's about seamlessly doing all of those things simultaneously. It's about changing the model and moving from a device-centric world to a user-centric world. That is, we've spent about 5 years now studying the market, looking at the architectural models, and then coming up with this model that says, instead of the device registering to the box and then being limited to what the box is capable of, which is what you see on the left, moving to this communications core style of architecture says that an individual user can register to the core, look at a user profile. The user profile says, hey, this is Tracy, and Tracy's carrying this device today. And because he's carrying that device, we're going to invoke these policies, and we're going to take these features and assign them to that device. It fundamentally changes the model that we used historically and provides us with some of that basic levels of granularity, not only of security, but also of what device, software assets, what applications and features and functionality they should be able to consume. But also, in a lot of ways, more importantly, it opens up the application layer for us to be able to come in a modular approach and start to address different areas of features and capabilities that individual users want, without going back and saying we got to upgrade the entire system to satisfy certain user segments. What this ultimately does is allows us to address individual user requirements in a far faster way and make it a lot easier for end users to consume. If we do those two things, the users will not look for ways to go around security mechanisms. They will not look to go out of the network, because they will be able to be provided these solutions naturally in a secured environment. So if you take this solution here one step further, I'm just waiting for it to catch up. There we go. If you take this solution sort of the next logical step, this gives you this concept, these three phases that we've gone through in the industry. And there's been some trends that have happened over the last little while. For a number of years, we lived in the legacy TDM, PBX world. And this was the individual devices were connected to the connection management layer, and the applications were driven by the switch itself. In 2001, 2002 timeframe, we really saw the dawn or the birth of the IP telephony era. And that was still, that was an interesting, great model for us at the time, but what it was doing was driving very specifically around voice over IP. And we took the same sort of architectural paradigm, moved from a traditional model to an IP-centric model. The same devices were connecting to a distributed core and getting primarily voice services. The next major transition in our industry is going to be moving from voice over IP to everything over IP. So every device out there will be driven in IP and leverage something called session initiation protocol. In order to do that, we're going to have to break the network up into sort of three logical layers. The access layer, which is where individual users will come and plug into. they'll plug into this intelligent core, which will define who they are, what device they have, where they are geographically, and then automatically be able to associate applications. And this model is not a pure voice-centric model anymore. It's all services across the board that we can define. But most importantly, it moves us from a device-centric architecture to a user-centric architecture. And that's what's going to give us the deeper levels of granularity and allows us to apply security in a much more holistic fashion.
Yeah, and this absolutely highlights this approach really highlights the enablement of true unified communications, because making these communication services, whether it's voice, video, desktop sharing, presence, instant messaging, so forth, making those available to users in ways that support their desire for device flexibility, you've now set the stage for an extended and a mobile enterprise that can maximize communication and collaboration. So as Tracy alluded to earlier, it's precisely those enhanced collaboration opportunities that can drive the productivity enhancements. So we're no longer talking about simply how quickly can I reach Tracy, but it's much more how seamlessly and transparently can Tracy and I escalate a session from an email or an instant message up to a voice conversation to a video and a shared desktop, and therefore do the most collaboration that we can given the devices that we happen to be in front of, whether we're on the road or in the office or at home.
Yeah, absolutely. And this slide here just sort of graphically represents what we just said. The concept that any individual user now in the network can go onto the network. They can with a communications core in place. They can consume whatever service might be available in the core. They can do that from whatever device they're carrying in their pocket or they're registered to at their desk. So the device is now independent. Historically, what we've done is we've taken a voice device and called it into a voice system. And if the voice system doesn't answer, it rolls over to voicemail. And if that doesn't work, we go over to the video device and we try to call somebody on a video device. When that doesn't work, it just typically just doesn't work. It goes nowhere because most video-based systems don't roll over. They're video. Then we hang that up and go and try instant messaging. With the communications core style model, any service escalates to any service. The individual user doesn't have to understand the different intricacies of all the different services. They just simply say, call this person, and the core will normalize that request. Start off in one modality and automatically roll over to another modality based on any number of criteria that are happening in the network. We believe that foundationally that is, in order to do that, a full SIP architecture ultimately is going to be where we need to get to, because SIP was designed for those very purposes, and that is foundational to really the underlying drivers of BYOD. To finish up on that, this concept of now that I have a communications core in place, how do I get access to it? Well, there's going to be a couple ways of doing that. The most traditional way of getting access is just extending using some sort of media gateway or a router or whatever you have extending that capability directly out to your corporate branch. So you plug into the Ethernet network and you're on net. That's sort of the most classical model. The next model that has emerged primarily is the ability to deploy some sort of virtual private network, be it IPsec or SSL VPN, and the devices, well, you actually establish a connection with your device into the communication. And those are great for very data-intensive sessions. They're not great for real-time communication sessions, because in order for you to be on the network, it's dependent upon you as the end user as launching that connection. So now that you've launched the connection, your device gets wrapped into the corporate network. And presence is available, and video and voice is now available, but it's still deterministic on the end user making some action, which is not great for real-time communications. And in some scenarios, we may not want the device ever to be actually part of the network. We may only want the application to come into the network. In those scenarios, we need to deploy something like a session border controller that has been specifically optimized for unified communication security. Not there's a lot of session border controllers out there that were built as primarily designed for intermediating between networks, creating SIP trunks from network 1 to network 2. In this kind of environment, an SBC that was optimized for UC security is designed to allow a lot of end users to be able to dynamically establish a session through the SBC. And what this model is doing is it's allowing the application itself to come into the network, and where the device is never challenged. Right? The device is never actually on the inside of the corporate network. Only the application is. When the device does go into the corporate network, inside we need the ability to be able to look at, from an identity management perspective, we need to be able to go in and look at what kind of device it is, what level of firmware the device is running, whether it meets corporate security standards, and if it does, let the device on the network, and if it doesn't, deny the device access to the network. And again, in the SBC environment, we may not want that device even on the network. We may only want to let the application. So if we're going to get into very serious real-time communications where we got presence, instant messaging, we're doing real-time voice and real-time video, then an SBC access point is going to be critical to the successful deployment of a BYOD program.
Yeah, and I think this is a great opportunity to underscore that when you're talking about BYOD, but really when you're talking about mobile workers in general, or using non-traditional endpoints, you've got to look at security implications from at least 3 levels. One is the device itself, and you know, there are solutions in terms of mobile device management products that can help you with protecting those devices, establishing policy, and so forth. There are steps that you need to take in terms of your productivity and business applications, in terms of reducing the data footprint that's on the device, or compartmentalizing that data on the device and encrypting it or protecting it, so that, again, referring back to what Tracy was saying earlier, so that the business or the enterprise can establish controls over its data without necessarily affecting all of the personal data. And that's the device side. But what Tracy was getting at in terms of the VPNs and the SBCs really focus on the 2 other aspects, which are the network itself and then the transmissions. And from a network standpoint, if you're going to be letting these devices in your network physically or logically, you need to be looking at things like network admission control solutions and location-based access controls. And you have to come to terms with the fact that perimeter security in a borderless world is very different than perimeter security in our historical world. Again, from a transmission standpoint, you want to make sure that under the right policies, that your data, your voice, your video streams are going to be secured. And so a lot of the device security side of this is independent of your communication core. But looking at how you're going to satisfy your network and transmission security requirements is something that you really want to then focus on the architecture of the communication core as you move forward. That's going to enable or perhaps be an obstacle to you really getting that mobile workforce empowered.
Yeah, absolutely. The concept of a layered security model is absolutely critical when it comes to that. The communications core is really the end result once you've gotten into the network. And a critical aspect of that I forgot to mention on the previous slide was, once you've done the security management and identity management, and we figured out who you are, it's highly likely that once you got onto the network in a Wi-Fi environment, that's going to be the predominant model that a lot of these devices are going to come into the network on. What we're going to see is, once you have a communications core in place, the interaction between the devices isn't going to primarily be for instant messaging and chat. We're going to see a lot of users saying, I'm going to call you on my mobile device to your mobile device in the building. Or I'm going to create a video session between my mobile device and your mobile device, and we're both in the building. However, the way that most wireless networks are architected today is that all of the wireless traffic and transmission actually gets traversed back to the core of the network. This is going to cause a challenge. So if you and I were both in the same building and our wireless core was somewhere else, we're going to be sending a tremendous amount of application data over the WAN or over this network that's not suitably designed for that. So the concept of being able to break the wireless model that we've historically done and move the media streams to the closest perimeter of the network. So move the actual streams that are carrying the voice and video traffic to the edge of the network in a next generation wireless network are going to be absolutely critical to the problem we mentioned earlier is if every user in your company starts bringing in 3 devices, we're going to have to be able to scale those wireless networks and have a different media flow than we've ever thought of before. So this concept of a split plane becomes critically important to this. The other side of that, just from an interesting premise, is as we're going to change this model, BYOD has some other premises as well. It starts to talk about how are we going to start to deploy these services. Are these services going to be purely done on premise? Is there going to be a hybrid effect to these services? And of course, can these services be hosted maybe in a service provider network? Well, from Avaya's perspective, we're really looking at this a number of different fronts. Here, maybe you have a wireless device and you've come into your corporate network and you've secured your device, you've secured the application. We're on an intelligently deployed and architected wireless LAN, but now I've decided that I want to get some new features and new capabilities. Well, one of the ways to do that is we build that new feature as an application into the core, and you simply download it. But some of the neat things that are coming up in this space is that application or that feature could also be deployed by a third party in somebody else's network somewhere. And because these networks are interrelated, now I simply say, hey, I like that capability, push the button, download that new capability onto my device, and it just natively and sort of intelligently continues to evolve, very much like the application store concept that we've seen that's successfully deployed in many other industries. So this capability of these new features and functionalities emerging into the platform without this historical model of, sorry, we're going to have to do a complete end-to-end technology refresh before you can get those 2 new features. We're also going to see that model being deployed in this sort of hybrid model where there's a tremendous amount of this model where we're going to be able to do this completely locally, but we're also going to be able to pull those applications and those features down from third-party sources, service providers, and partners and ecosystem members that are developing those applications. And then, of course, finally, you'll see the same type of model exist where all of those elements are purely hosted within somebody else's data network. So the ultimate form of BYOD is bring whatever device you want into the network, have that being consuming services that may not even be local to your network. A couple of good examples of that are solutions from Avaya, such as Avaya Live Engage, which is a 3-dimensional audio system or collaboration system, if you will. It's an avatar-based spatial audio system. So you go into this virtual world and you walk around that virtual world, and you can walk into a meeting room, and you can push a button and share your desktop and do real-time video. It's a fascinating 3-dimensional world that is entirely cloud-based, and it's going to start to change some of our normal way of thinking when it comes to this, and as we expand even further beyond sort of the BYOD framework. Because once you have your devices, we're going to want to do more and more things with them and more services with them.
Yeah, and again, we concur from an infotech standpoint that the real key to enabling the user productivity isn't about letting them use their device. It's about making sure that they're able to use their device in the service of the business. And so providing a variety of approved applications through any of these delivery mechanisms that can be used on the range of devices that your users are going to bring into your environment, that's, if you focus on that, you can reduce the perceived need to use various unmanaged or insecure applications. You know, you can drive down the need that people may be seeing to use FaceTime or use Skype, and instead use corporate communication applications and use corporate productivity applications. And in some cases, you'll get to the point where you may need to restrict use of some of these other applications in order to meet business requirements. But whether it's web-enabled internal applications, whether it's web apps from a hosted environment, whether it's virtualized applications or virtual desktops, however you're going to deliver those out, what matters is making sure that you're delivering them in a way that doesn't have a huge data footprint on your users and doesn't restrict them in terms of the devices they'll be able to use.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing that in the market today within the consumerization space. When you make things simple and it's just a natural reaction to do that, then people are automatically going to tend towards using those services. It's when we make them complicated and complex to use is where people then say, well, I still need to achieve something that's going on, so I'm going to go out and find whatever way. And that might be, finding a third-party service on the internet that stores files, or it might be some other mechanism around what is perceived as the local service. So solving for these problems is more than just saying yes or no to the device. It's about solving some of the base underlying tenets of those models that we've laid out and understanding what those challenges are. If we peer into the future just a little bit in terms of where we think this could go next, everything from a classic SIP trunking model where we're going to just take one network and connect it up to the other network. A lot of the technologies in a communications core in the service provider domain is predicated on something referred to as IMS, or IP Multimedia Subsystem, which is sort of the reference architecture that the service providers are using to build these next generation networks for cellular and corporate system, or cellular and service provider architectures. A well-architected communications core, from our perspective, will leverage a lot of these principles. And in the Avaya world, that is what we really refer to as Avaya Aura. So Avaya Aura is the communications core framework that we're building, and it's following and leveraging the principles in an IMS style model. And if we look in our crystal ball, what we can see going down the road is not only a fixed mobile convergence discussion where we take a phone call that migrates from a Wi-Fi network to a cellular network, but down the road we could look forward and see this migrating into a model where we do entire session handoff. So it not only moves from one device to another device, but it can move modality. So maybe we start a call as video, or start a call as audio, we escalate to video, and then the video migrates from one device in one network to another device in another network. An example might be I'm doing a video call on my iPhone, and I walk into a building, and my video transitions from my iPhone to a video conferencing room that I'm in my building. So we can actually move the media. When we start to do this, BYOD becomes even a more important model where the device actually starts to become less and less relevant, and what happens is the business function is what we're driving. And we have more control over the media, the delivery of the media, and it just becomes transparent to the user. The user knows that they have absolute mobility because I can start a call in my office, go and jump in the car, and if it needs to move from video to audio, then the network will handle that because it knows maybe my device in the car is not the best place to do video, so automatically downspeed it to an audio call, and I carry on. So this level of intelligence in the network will transcend into the enterprise, and then you'll see a merging of those two sort of models, and that's really going to start to drive into these models where the devices just sort of blend into the background, and it just becomes a natural transaction that you don't have to think about to drive this next generation UC model.
Yeah, and from our perspective, again, it's the development of some of these foundational technologies, the SIP trunking and IMS peering, the increasing availability of the FMC technologies and driving towards the session handoffs, and then recognizing that the mobile devices are themselves getting more and more powerful every year thanks to Moore's Law. There really is a bright future for UC and a very important role there for bring your own device programs. So when you look at all these factors together and some of the things we've talked about in terms of device and application security, the message to us is clear. Bring your own device and consumerization don't have to equate with anarchy. In fact, we at Infotech look at this and say that the challenges to security and applications and communications that bring your own programs and consumer devices represent are not just challenges, but they're actually incredible opportunities for organizations to drive productivity increases and transform the way that they're delivering services from traditional endpoint-related services to much more flexible and much more end-user focused ways for our users and our customers to work how, when, and where from whatever devices make the most sense to them.
Yeah, Absolutely, and I think the next couple of years are going to be quite exciting in this case. I agree that this is not an opportunity for anarchy in the market. It's going to be, let's look at these as opportunities to improve user communication, and this is stuff that's happening anyway. So we now have a model, a reference model, or an architectural reference model to start to drive into this next generation model. Like the last 10 years has been about voice over IP. The next 10 years is going to be about everything over IP, and SIP is going to drive that. And it's the end user, the ease of the end user being able to use and consume stuff. The more difficult we make it, that's when we're going to have people going in different directions. So sure, this is the best time to maybe open it up for some Q&A.
I fully agree. And we have our first question. What do you see for the future of PBXs and desk phones? And I just want to let everyone know, please use the question pane to ask a question. Thank you.
Is that directed at, maybe myself, how do you want to handle the Q&A component?
Tracy, why don't we go to you first? What do you see for the future of PBXs and desk phones?
Well, I mean, obviously, Avaya is a very large, very significant player in that market, and I had the one slide up that talked about the PBX architecture and how that migrated into an IP PBX architecture, and then moving into this next generation framework. So I think PBX is, I think the death of the PBX, a lot of people have been predicting that, is a little premature in the sense that I don't think that model has to die as much as evolve. And we've seen the evolution into the IP PBX, and now with the communications core, you're sort of disaggregating the PBX and you're rebuilding into its logical function. So instead of it being a voice switching system, now we can build a model that's inherently all media and doing so natively. That opens the opportunity for us to be able to do the kinds of things we've done in a voice-only world for years in a complete multimedia model. What we don't think is the right model is simply trying to layer on other capabilities onto the traditional architectural models that have existed for years. So this next evolution is going to be critical. And when you look at the sort of the Aura reference architecture we've laid out in detail with our customers, those customers that come from the Heritage Nortel side of the business or the Heritage Avaya side of the business, that there are individual roadmaps that take their PBXs to IP PBXs and then inclusive into a communications core architecture. As for the endpoints themselves, I think that's an interesting question. I've seen some customers go out and say, we are going to get rid of all of our phones and move 100% to a mobile model. Okay? And I've even seen some customers put a restriction in place that says you're allowed to have a hard phone or a soft phone. And invariably in those models, what ended up happening was people started off with soft phones, they had some challenges, and they got rid of it and went to a hard phone. I think that's the wrong model. I don't think the model should exist where we force one or the other. I think the model we'll see over time is that we're going to start to move towards more soft-style clients, but it should be a natural act. In a communications core model, the device goes away in the sense of how I want to consume the services. If I want to consume the services from a desk phone, fine. If I want to consume the services from a client, fine. And there's no penalty of doing that. So I think over time you will start to see this natural evolution of a soft client model, but that shouldn't penalize the old style phone users. And I think we're going to see a hybrid environment there for a number of years.
Yeah, I'd follow on that as well and note to really underscore what Tracy was saying, that the traditional PBX functions in terms of voice switching and the traditional desk phone in terms of being a common endpoint, those don't go away. They become part of a subset of what the next generation PBXs are really able to offer. That's one capability on the voice side. It's one type of endpoint among many that are now going to be supported. I think the other thing to recognize in terms of the future of PBXs and desk phones as well, but it is the hybrid of on-premise and hosted capabilities, and seeing a much more seamless hybrid and integration between those, so that I think we'll see over the next several years more development of capabilities both on the on-premise and in the hosted world to allow you to mix and match certain services. You may be looking at delivering your primary IP voice services with some on-site PBX technology, but you may marry that to a hosted web conferencing capability. And making that marriage be very seamless and transparent will be key, but allowing that flexibility so that organizations can look and see which is going to make most sense for them. Does it make sense to host your own web conferencing capability? Does it make sense to take advantage of a third party? And having that flexibility is really what the next generation of PBX functionality is about.
Great. So we have a number of people joining us from Alberta Health Services. So here's a question from them. What has been the major challenges for those hospitals who have adopted this model of bring your own device? Tracy, we'll start with you.
Well, I think it's an interesting model, and I've spent a fair bit of time out in Western Canada, not just recently. The model is, I think, when we get into a lot of trouble is when people buy into a specific type of technology. So let's say bring your own device, and that means we're going to go all IP. Well, specifically in a hospital, that's not necessarily always the best model. There's lots of places in a hospital that will benefit from and will continue to use digital technologies for years and years to come. Especially in the healthcare environment, the flexibility of services is critical. So we have to be able to go into those types of models and say, doctors, physicians, nurses can benefit from these, want to consume these types of services on these types of devices. However, we still need the patient rooms and other facilities that may need these types of devices. And to go into a model that is either all PBX or all voice over IP is very, very restrictive. So the concept of this three-tier architecture that is Aura allows us to leverage intelligent TDM-based systems where they make the most sense. Next-generation clients, such as one sitting on laptops and iPads, and for physicians to be able to leverage. Those individuals connect directly into a core, so mobility across multiple hospitals and multiple facilities becomes natural, and then the ability to apply policies. Some of the challenges we want to make sure that we're driving for there is we have to make sure that those devices are secure. We have to make sure that mobility is enabled natively. And this is not a model of saying throw at everything that you had before and start from scratch. One, it's just not practical, and we can leverage a lot of that infrastructure. So I think those are some of the challenges that I would bring up right out of the gate. And then the ability for us to take those services and add intelligence to them and contextual information to them. So I'm a doctor, I'm in this building, and a patient pushes a button. Not only can they maybe get routed to the right physician at the right time, but we can bring a lot of context to those solutions. So BYOD is functionally a lot more than just picking the right device.
Yeah, I'd elaborate on that as well, which, there's an aspect of this in the hospital or the healthcare delivery mechanism which really needs to focus on location-based security. And so we've spoken to other clients of ours that have dealt with this question, and allowing a personal device to access certain systems within the confines of the hospital itself, but from the coffee shop across the street, that the access would be limited to patient records. So location-based security services is a key. Minimizing the device data footprint, also important. Again, when you're starting to talk about healthcare privacy information, minimizing what's actually resident on the device versus what is accessible through the device when it's connected is a really key strategy there. And then lastly, and this is much more pragmatic, but there's the consideration of how you're going to deal with disinfecting devices if they're going to be brought into the healthcare delivery arena, where traditionally the IT equipment that's being used in the healthcare world is it is dealt with from a disinfection, from a cleaning standpoint to make sure that it's not going to be a problem. This is just an extra complication that comes into it because, frankly, most of the end user devices that are out there can't be disinfected using the traditional approaches, at least not without damaging the touchscreens and so forth. So that's an extra consideration that needs to be worked on. And in some cases, we see that that's handled in terms of a policy, which is your own device can be used in certain circumstances, but when you're talking about going into the particular patient's room or into the active delivery of the healthcare, then that needs to transfer over to an enterprise-provided device, which is able to be properly disinfected. And so again, that kind of highlights the importance, though, of being able to shift sessions from one device to another, so that when you change your context of what you're doing in that healthcare arena, you're going to be able to go to the right device based on what you're going to be needing to do.
Our next question is, will Android evolve to provide satisfactory corporate security requirements, and if so, when? James, why don't we start with you this one?
Okay. I'm going to say yes, I expect that they're going to evolve to better satisfy corporate security requirements. As to when, I'm not entirely sure. I would certainly say that right now the means that organizations need to be looking at, whether it's Android, iPhone, not so much a BlackBerry problem historically, is to look at a quality mobile device management suite that's going to allow certain policies to be established on these devices. There's a lot of focus on Android right now in terms of security risks because of the different approach they've taken to the Android marketplace than Apple has taken with the App Store. But the reality is that we are seeing some malware on the iOS side starting as well. It's not purely an Android restriction. This again gets to where I say, if you can't control the device because it's a personal device or a shared use device, if you can't stop the user from putting on their own applications, which frankly is if it's your own device, they're going to expect to be able to do so. You have to have good protections in place to compartmentalize the business data and business applications, keep them separate, and provide some reactive security as well in case the device is compromised at some point. It's not a great story, but the fact is that the less you put in terms of data on the device itself, the less at risk an Android device is going to make that data, or an iPhone is going to make that data.
Yeah, I would agree with the comments. An MDM model, the first phase of security is always going to be looking at the device, challenging the device. Who are you? What kind of device are you? What version are you? What subversion? And a lot of those components. Generally, that's been a lot easier in the BlackBerry and in the iOS world, just because they're known states. You know what the BlackBerry is. There's one iteration of iOS, and there's different devices, but there's generally one iteration, and you know what version it's at. One of the challenges in the Android world is just the fragmentation style of the operating system is challenging. So that is going to be more around the MDM solution and how we can understand that. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit cleaner when you can go to a device with an operating system and scrub it to figure out where some of the challenges are. But we certainly see Android coming into this market in a big way. In fact, we've done already Android development, and some of our solutions are already inherently enabled and leverage Android. So we certainly see it as a viable platform and model. But the security factor is going to be a big deal for a lot of these models. So I don't know I can say when we think that'll come into the mainstream. Some of these capabilities, our capabilities today, are looking at that first layer of screening of device, targeting what kind of browser it has, what kind of device software it has, before it ever gets passed too far into the network.
All right, great. We've got a question around wireless. Any issues with the wireless or gray zones? And if so, how do you overcome gray zones? Tracy, start with you.
Yeah, if I start with the first part of the question, there's a ton of issues with wireless, and it depends on where we are across the wireless spectrum, right? If we go back to if the wireless network is deployed, if that wireless network is 3-4 years old, and we're still leveraging things like 802.11b, then there's definitely different issues that we're going to have to contend with. Gray zones typically have been a problem in that space. one of the best ways in the past to deal with gray zones has been leveraging technology such as 802.11a, but it hasn't really become a commercially successful model because of the number of radios that it has historically derived from. So a proper wireless assessment and putting the proper tools on the network become critical for that kind of discussion. But as I was mentioning before, one of the other just fundamental challenges we're going to have with wireless on these older networks is this proliferation of devices that come onto the network. So how are we going to be able to scale volume? How are we going to be able to move across these devices, so subnet mapping and moving across these subnets, quality of service that we can now address in these networks with some of the technologies that Avi's bringing in the market in our portfolio. And then finally, I think one of the big ones is that if you're bringing your own device, if you're bringing an Android or an iOS device, and it has capability like FaceTime or a video client that's sitting right on the device, all of a sudden that device changes its characteristics, and you're expecting to be able to do video of the person that's down the hall or in another building, and that's going to the classic hub and spoke style of wireless means that all traffic goes back to a single wireless controller somewhere, and the wireless controller then takes that information and sends it out to the individual devices, even if the devices are relatively close to each other. So to change that behavior, it would also help with the coverage discussion, but to change that behavior, what we need to do is break that model and move the wireless control path closer to the edge of the network. So we have something called split plane wireless that allows us to take the control plane and route that locally, so that if we got two iPhones in the same building and they want to do a video call between them, then the media path will actually get routed at the local switching layer, and that media will not traverse all the way back to the core. That's going to allow us to not only scale locally, but it's going to allow us to minimize bandwidth on the wide area network and reduce that bottlenecking effect. That's a different model than we've seen. You've seen there's been a number of phases of wireless network deployments, and wireless networks have always sort of been considered, my primary use case is going to be sitting at my desk and wired, and then wireless is kind of a convenience. And I've seen some companies taking that into effect, that wireless was always the convenience factor. BYOD changes that discussion. Wireless, and certainly from in a bias perspective and from my day-to-day use, wireless to me isn't a convenience, it's an expectation. I look at wireless now as a utility. When I just showed up at the Belleville office today, I don't have an office in this building, I don't come here all that often, but when I came in, I expected my device to just wake up and be on the network. I didn't have to fish around for an Ethernet cable. And I absolutely expect the same level of security and performance on my wireless networks as on my wired network. To do that, we are going to have to take into consideration some of the engineering characteristics and the capacity discussions, because those capacity models have not traditionally been deployed before in our classic networks, and I think we're seeing that. So I'll ask James to give your perspective on that.
Yeah, I very much would agree, and simply say that in our research we've been focusing on the shift over the last few years from a coverage density model of wireless network planning to a capacity density model. And so you're no longer, looking at how you're going to deploy your wireless simply to make sure you've got bars of some strength at all points in your campus or inside your building. But now it's more of a question of how much capacity do each of those access points have? How can we handle the movement between the various access points in a seamless way, and be able to support this incredibly large volume of rich media traffic that's going to be going over the wireless. So this can be done with a denser deployment of 802.11n devices. Certainly, as things start to become clearer with the 802.11ac, that's really going to open up more capability there. What we are seeing is, with this shift from a coverage to a capacity model, though, what we are definitely seeing is an interest from from our clients, driven in part by BYO, but just in part by being able to be more flexible and reduce your costs on cabling, to go to a primarily wireless access layer for the network. And of course, to do that, that means you're putting another level of reliability and capacity on that wireless that has never been expected before. And so there is a pretty profound shift there, but that shift is what's necessary to allow for the always-on real-time access type of functionality for wireless connected devices.
All right, here's a question for more materials. Are there any more materials, white papers, guides, policies, etc., that you could recommend to people on the webinar? Tracy, we'll start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly I would suggest people start off with avaya.com. There's a tremendous amount of information up there, from white papers to seminars to you name it. There's a tremendous amount of material at avaya.com. For those looking for more technical, deep dive type of discussions, you can try support.avaya.com, which are going to get you much more product-centric details. But those two places should give you lots of reading material.
Yeah, and from an infotech standpoint, we've been watching consumerization and BYO as a very important topic. Harkening back to the very first slide that Tracy was talking to about the various trends that are going at it. Infotech's been looking at the trends of social media, big data, collaboration, mobility, security, and cloud, and how those converge. And one of the main places where they converge is on this consumerization topic. So we've got a number of publications when it comes to consumerization from a CIO policy standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, from an application development standpoint. We've also just recently published one called Tackling the Technology of Consumerization, and it's very much a capstone that links out to many of our other resources. So I'd recommend for our Infotech customers, certainly take a look at those, and particularly that Tackling the Tech, and that becomes a really good entryway into a number of our other related research about BYO programs and the challenges and opportunities of consumerization.
And finally, I'd urge people to check out the collaboration silo over at smartest-it.com. It'll give you a nice little taste of the research that James was talking about. Our final question of the day is, how is Wi-Fi support requirements different for mobile devices and these advanced communications capabilities? What should Wi-Fi planners plan for? James, we'll start with you.
Sure. So I touched a bit on this in terms of planning for capacity as opposed to for coverage, and that's a big aspect of it, of course. But I would be looking at it from also from the standpoint of the network design and the security that's associated with it. As you're looking at the proliferation of different mobile devices, and what was referred to earlier about the questions of security requirements for Android or other devices. You really do need to take a hard look at how these mobile devices are being allowed to access services in your environment. And I would say historically I was uncomfortable from a pure security standpoint with simply saying this is a trusted company-provided device, and therefore it's definitely inside the organization as well. The fact is that even those company-provided devices were often very much unmanaged or suboptimally managed. So the BYO advances really force the organization to come to terms with how do you deal with these semi or perhaps not at all secure devices that people are bringing in. And that's something that Tracy referred to a little bit as well. But you definitely need to be looking at wireless network segmentation as a way to deal with this, so that if you have certain devices that meet the corporate security requirements that can be put through a set of security criteria, then and only then should those devices be allowed deeper access into the network. And other devices that can't meet all of those security requirements need to be provided access through a guest wireless or a carved off piece of wireless, which is much more tightly monitored and controlled. And so I think that, and I mentioned this earlier, that BYO programs really they underscore the importance for organizations to do this, but it's not just because you've got BYO mobile devices. these are frankly things that organizations should be looking at from their wireless provisioning and wireless security, whether they've got BYO or not. And so BYO is in many ways, we feel, a catalyst for dealing with something that the organization should already be dealing with, that network security, network segmentation, and layers, essentially. If you can authenticate, you'll get into the first layer. If you can authenticate and your device can be confirmed as secure, you get into the deeper layer. And if all of those things are met, then you can get right into the guts of the internal network. And trying to do that in simply saying you're on or you're off, you're either not going to be allowing many devices into resources that would make them more productive, or you're going to be opening up a lot of security holes. And neither of those is an ideal circumstance.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, and I think we've had some good discussion on the wireless side. I think an area that we probably haven't spent a lot of time on in wireless is, and it's very clear that if you're a known user to the corporation, so I'm a member of the domain, I work for the company, and when I log on with my network credentials, it tells people who I am and where I am and what device I have. So there's a lot of known there, and I can address that fairly easily. I'm likely registering, using security, 802.1x type of stuff, and that's against a known user. One of the challenges that we're certainly going to see, and this is especially, I think, relevant in healthcare, is the transient user. Are people walking into my environment and they're going to be there for a couple hours, and they're there and they want to consume a utility, which is this wireless network. What's the mechanism for them to walk off the street and get onto the network? And there's different ways of doing that. And James mentioned one is segmentation. Well, you could stand up a wireless network that basically goes between your site and the internet, and period. And they won't ever get anywhere else, and just leave it wide open. There's different liabilities with those types of systems. You have to make that model easy. So the thing of this kind of guest access, or this web-based model. So you walk into a company, you say, I want Wi-Fi, please, and it will redirect, the device will redirect to a web page. And the web page will simply say, who are you? What kind of device are you carrying? Are you looking for guest access? They can fill in their own credentials. Yeah, the end user could do that. You could have an administrator that is setting it up for you in terms of guest access. And then you just go through like a building check system would, that, hey, I'm going to be here for the day, and I want access to the internet, and maybe I've been vetted by somebody else, and it says I can also be on VLAN X, which gives me access to these services. But they go through with these restrictive guest access models. What that ends up doing is forcing people to be a little bit more creative, and then one user gets the information and they share it with some other user. So again, it's around that simplicity of access method. And having those systems do some interrogation, figure out what networks you should have access to, so that guest access type of system becomes critically important. And it's not something that is inherent in a lot of Wi-Fi networks. You see it, hotels are probably an area we're seeing that being used a lot right now when you're in a hotel. But hotels generally are doing, all they're doing is getting you access to the raw internet. In a corporation, it's going to be more than that, and you don't want to have to set up completely architecturally separate networks, because then there's the overlay cost, there's the complexity, and the complexity ultimately leads to a higher cost network and a higher support cost. So building in these intelligent front-end systems is going to drive and do a lot of these things. And I agree with James' assertion around it. These things have existed for a long time in networks, and BYO programs are simply exposing some of these challenges. I know, and I brought my own map to work about 5 years ago at Avaya. So I mean, it's not just a mobile device phenomenon that's driving this in the wireless. I mean, I'm at a point right now where the device that I carry doesn't even have an Ethernet port on it. If I want an Ethernet port, I physically have to plug in an adapter to get an Ethernet port. So Wi-Fi for me is just the way I connect. So we're going to have to take all those other considerations into place and start treating the Wi-Fi networks as production networks, and not sort of the, you use that when Ethernet's not available.
All right, thank you. That brings us to the end of today's webinar. A big thank you to both our speakers for joining and for all your insights today. We will be sending out an email with the slide deck and a link to the webinar. Thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful day.